an introduction. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Indies Insights. Today, we have got some very special guests today. We've got News Corporation, wonderful supporters of the Indies, and we've got the wonderful and very, very smart Bethan Hockey. She is from the Research Distillery. Now, I've just had this clarified. This is actually not a distillery with alcohol. So, Mark O'Brien, please stand down. Just continue to tune in. It's actually a very, very smart research, not a wing. They're a separate business to News, but they're funded by them. They do some really, really interesting things. In fact, I saw some bit of research from the guys and Dan over there just a couple of weeks ago, and I was really, really impressed by the work they were doing about influence. But Bethan's going to talk about audio and putting audio in the mix and the podcast playbook. Without further ado, Bethan, I'll hand over to you and I'll keep my big mouth shut. Over to you.
Awesome. Thank you very much. And thanks very much for having me today. Just to give you a little overview of why we wanted to do this research and why we felt it was important before I dive in. We know that actually Australia leads the world in podcast consumption. We are the biggest listeners of podcasts. But what we found is that actually a lot of the research that's been done is either at a global level or just looks at behaviours. And what we really wanted to do with this piece of work was get under the skin to really understand, first and foremost, what makes them so special. Why are they this really unique media channel that we can tap into? And lastly, what does that mean for brands? So if you are a brand, how do you harness this in a way that actually integrates into the experience rather than disrupts? And how do you really get the most effective use of your advertising spend when using the channel? So I'm going to take you through 3 sections today. And to start with, we will just look at what is it about podcasts that makes them so special? Why are they this unique medium? And why do we engage with them? And the first thing to note is that podcasts have built this incredibly loyal and highly engaged audience. We can see that 3/4 of listeners are listening to multiple podcasts a week. And what's more important is that as we kind of see this fragmentation of the media landscape, podcasts have built a really high, a really clear, a really routine and ritual regular engagement with their listeners. People are tuning in and they're doing it often. More importantly than the frequency, what we found is that podcast listener engagement eclipses all other medias. So when we looked at listeners, of all the media that they consume, they rank podcasts as the most engaged when they are listening to this. So 92% say that they are engaged whilst listening. It's not a passive experience. And of that 92, 60% are highly engaged when listening. They choose it as more engaged than some of the video channels that we assess too. So more engaged than YouTube, more engaged than TV streaming and free-to-air TV. So there's this really high engagement channel. And the engagement goes beyond the listening experience. So what we can see is that there is a lot of action beyond that initial experience of listening to podcasts. 1 in 4 are reading articles or searching to deep dive into the content that they hear about. 2 in 5 follow the host on social media, and 1 in 4 are watching videos or live streams of the podcast as well. So is this multimedia format? And the kind of key thing that makes the medium distinct is this intimacy and authenticity of it, and its ability to foster really deep connections with listeners. When we ask people, they talk about podcasts as this kind of intimate space. It's a space for safe topics, more sensitive topics, and for authentic conversation. So you can see there 2/3 are saying that podcasting is this personal and intimate experience. And we can see that reflected in almost entirely all occasions being solo. We can also see it's this safe space. So we're allowed to talk about or more open to hearing about things in a sensitive, less spoken about topics. And 78% see it as a space for hosts to be authentic and vulnerable. And why this is important is that openness, that vulnerability creates a really strong personal bond between the podcast and the listener. What we can see is that 3/4 of podcast listeners feel a genuine connection to the host that they listen to. And more importantly, this goes beyond just that individual connection. They actually feel a sense of belonging and community. 67% saying that they feel that sense of belonging. And this high engagement and connection gives podcasts unprecedented power and efficacy as trusted advisors. I'll go into what I mean by this in a little bit more detail. Podcast hosts are highly trusted. When it comes to trusting the credibility and the accuracy of the topics that they cover, podcasts score higher than all other mediums for podcast listeners. So it is something that they intuitively trust. And because of that, it means that the host recommendations are incredibly influential. That trust goes beyond the content and actually goes into brand and product recommendations. You can see there over half of listeners say that they trust the recommendations of the host that they listen to. And lastly, when we talk about what makes podcasting distinct, it's the on-the-go and on-demand nature that makes them not only a high trust place, but a constant trusted companion. It's that access to a world of content that has really created these on-demand experts. So people can tap into advice and information and influence, importantly, at any time of day and at any place. Half of podcast occasions happen outside of the home, and 1 in 3 of those are on the go, whether they're out and about, whether they're exercising, driving, or commuting. We even found that 1 in 10 are listening before they go to bed as a way to help them relax and go to sleep. And crucially, the ability to listen while doing something else opens up those listening experiences. So it allows podcasts to create new consumption occasions where a lot of other media can't play. So 1 in 2 say that they are doing something else whilst they're listening, whether that's driving, whether that's working, whether that's doing chores. It's this companionship that allows podcasts to open up those experiences where you are hands-free. Similarly, the no screens element. 3/4 see it as a way to take a break from screen-based media. So they're using it to kind of overcome screen fatigue and replace screen-based. And lastly, the portability of it. We know that 82% of listening happens on a smartphone, which just amplifies that sense that you can be anywhere and at any time. And then when we look at why people choose to listen, we've grouped these into 4 core motivations. We actually have 12 distinct listening motivations underneath these. But when we look at it at a kind of higher level, we can see that there's 4 core motivations for why people choose to listen to a podcast. Overwhelmingly, the biggest is to learn. So this is all about staying up to date, being informed, learning something new. It's about that kind of focus, using podcasts to spark joy or inspiration and to feel that they're learning something. And 3/4 of listeners have had this type of experience in the last year. The second is purely entertainment. So this can come in lots of forms. It can come in comedy, fun, through to wanting to feel a sense of connection and listening as a shared experience. But it's all about content that stimulates, that gives them a positive uplift. And you can see there 2/3 of listeners have had that type of experience. Thirdly, we have escape. And this is really about this welcome distraction or an escape from reality. For a lot of people, it's also about companionship during chores, during work, or during quiet times. It's purely having something to take them away from what they're doing. And then lastly, the 4th motivation is to relax. So this tends to be a bit more of a ritualistic event, to wind down, to switch off. And whilst the content may vary, we actually had a lot of people who listen to true crime to relax. It's not all light topics. But it's about this sense of kind of self-care. There's a focused intention with it. And they tend to be quite ritualistic. And again, just under half have had this type of listening experience in the last year. So 4 core motivations that we were able to identify. And as I kind of touched on, these motivations break down into a diverse mix of needs that podcasts can deliver to. I won't go into all of these in detail today. We have the detail underneath these, but you can see under each of these to take learn, for example, we have learn for fun versus learning for work, a much more purposeful educational piece. To stay up to date or informed, Think news updates, analysis, opinion, and then lastly for personal growth. So really ways to kind of improve yourself. So each of these break down, there are very kind of distinct reasons for it, which are useful when we come to targeting. And so in summary, the true power of podcasts really lie on this on-demand expertise that people can access, and that high trust and high engagement medium that make them really distinct from a lot of other media channels. And when harnessed effectively, they really do have this unprecedented efficacy as these trusted audio advisors, high influence, high engagement, high connection. They are a platform of potential for advertisers. Before I go into how brands can harness this most effectively, I just wanted to touch on this anatomy of that trusted audio advisor. Not all podcasts are made equal in this space, and how do you identify the ones that are the most trusted? We have highlighted 4 key stages, the ways that podcasts can build trust and connection with consumers. And it's interesting to note that this is more about just shared interests and relatability of the host. What we found is that actually podcast listeners want a little bit more than that. They first and foremost want the content to be informative. They want to feel like they're learning something. They want it delivered in a way that's engaging by hosts that are seen as expert in a way that feels authentic. And I'll go into each of these in a little bit more detail, but essentially these are cumulative. We start at step 1 and work our way through, and that's really the key to building trust. So if we look at content that's informative, this really is the cornerstone of trust, and it is the number 1 reason that people say they choose to listen to a podcast. They want to learn, and they want to feel like they're getting something out of the listening experience. So when it comes to what do we do in this space, it's really about elevating that depth of research, the fact-checking that goes into the development of podcasts, and consistently delivering that well-structured, substantial content that educates and enriches. We can see it is the most important feature when choosing a podcast is that interesting topics or content. And they're really looking to learn new things. They want variety. They want interesting, in-depth topic or conversation or analysis. But it's all about feeling like you've taken something away from it. And this really is the fundamental in building trust. The second is around the engaging delivery. And there are 2 aspects to this when it comes to engaging. The first is around the quality. So there is a wealth of podcasts available out there and levels of professionalism in how they are produced. What we can see is that high quality, easy to listen to, clear sound is a key factor in building trust. It feels like there has been effort that has gone into it, and it makes it easier for the listeners to engage. The second aspect of this is around the host, and it is an engaging host that people want. This was higher when we ranked these attributes. What we found is that a host that is engaging is significantly more important than a host that's relatable. I don't need to feel like they're like me, but I need to be engaged by how they are delivering. Similarly, 1 in 3 are saying that great storytelling or humor and entertainment value are some of the key features that help them choose the podcast that they engage with. So when it comes to how do we amplify this and how do we ensure that our delivery is engaging, it's all about this dynamic kind of expressive narrative style, storytelling elements, and this sense of immersive and engaging listening experiences. Similarly, leveraging that high quality audio and elevating the podcast experience ensures that the content is not only heard, but it's easily enjoyed without distraction. The third is around expert hosts. And I think it's worth noting here that expertise can come in many shapes or forms. Expertise can be external credentials or professional experience, but it equally can be delivered through a passion. Listeners want to feel that there has been work that has gone into the podcast, and that the hosts have a genuine passion and interest in it and are then able to share something new. This is equally important if the topic is reality TV as much as it is economics and politics. There's a real desire that people want their host to have knowledge of the topic that they're talking about. And 1 in 3 say that in-depth research and analysis is a really important feature to making a great podcast. So if we can, there's a potential to elevate that experience, credential, expertise. But more importantly, it's about the passion that they have for the topic that they're talking about. It's about sharing information freely, and really enhancing that podcast sense of authority on a content and topic. And then the last way to build trust is around this authenticity. So feeling authentic. We can see that when we look across all of podcast formats, the number one style and preferred style is a conversational format. People feel that it is more spontaneous, it's more impromptu, and they actually feel more part of the discussion. They're more engaged with it. And really that sense of authenticity is where this connection is really formed. Listeners gravitate towards the hosts that feel honest, they feel real, they feel conversation, and they're open to being vulnerable. So there's a real balancing act of professional delivery and expertise with this sense of authenticity, transparency. And what really works in this medium is sharing these more kind of unscripted reactions or insights. It makes the host feel more relatable, more honest, and resonates with audiences on a much more personal level. And so now the section where I feel like you're all asking, okay, what does this mean? How do brands harness podcasts? And knowing what we know about the medium, that high engagement, that loyalty, the audience is ripe to talk to. How, as brands, can we best harness the podcast channel? And I think it's worth noting that podcasts, when used effectively, are the ultimate matchmaker. There's this ability to create a halo effect on both the brand and podcast by effective placement. So not only do we know that the audiences are highly engaged with podcasts and what they're listening to, they also pay attention to the adverts in podcasts. 1 in 2 actually engage with it and pay attention. We also, within this research, we looked at the skippability of podcast adverts, and what we found is that 3/4 are actually not regularly skipping the adverts. It's not a habitual thing to skip through, and for a lot of the more regular listeners, they actually engage much more significantly with podcast advertising. And more so than that, there is this trust in host, but it also translates to that positive perceptions of the brand. For podcast listeners, podcasts are actually one of the more preferred places to hear advertising, and it is something that they do engage with. And crucially, effective brand placement can fast track brand consideration. So we know that podcasts and hosts have this role as a trusted advisor. The effective brand placement can directly put your brand into consideration set. So we move further down the funnel from awareness into consideration purely by dint of it's feeling like someone I know is recommending a product to me. And that expertise, that trust that people have helps to bypass some of the skepticism, and really does make listeners more inclined to consider products or advertising. What we've seen is that 1 in 10 listeners actually have bought something that they've heard from a podcast advertising, but many more have taken action and looked into brands, have engaged with them, and have put them into their consideration set. But how do we get brand placement the most effective it can be? Context is crucial. So brands have 3 ways to align their advertising and build relevance. What we found is that when brands can integrate seamlessly into the podcast itself, it doesn't disrupt the experience. It can actually elevate and be part of the conversation rather than an intrusion into it. And there are 3 ways to do this. I'll go through each of these in detail. The first is aligning to the motivation. So we know why people choose to listen to podcasts. We identified those 4 buckets and 12 micro motivations. And aligning your brand message to this audience motivation for listening can really help to cement and create this kind of seamless interaction. So by aligning products that offer similar benefits, like relaxation, with the listener's intent, the brand can create this more harmonious and impactful advertising experience. We feel relevant in that moment, but also beneficial to the audience's motivation of what they're trying to get out of the podcast. So again, brands and products that can align to those motivations can really target consumers in the moment where they are seeking a certain outcome. The second way to align is to align to the content vertical, the topic, or the genre. This might feel the most distinct, but it really helps to optimize brand impact. There are a couple of key topics where advertising is actually more appealing than others. Cooking, food and drink, travel, lifestyle, technology, film and TV, and health and wellness. These work particularly well where the listener interest is already peaked. They are entering into these to find out new things about these topics. And so the correct and relevant brand advertising is not only contextually relevant, but it's actually anticipated by audiences. They're already engaged and open to learning about related products and services. And so brand placement here just amplifies what we're looking to achieve. And then lastly, aligning to the host. And when I say aligning to the host, this is really to the personal preferences, the personality, and if possible, the actual usage of a product and service. We know that host-read ads are 1.5 times more appealing than pre-produced or radio-style adverts. But the key to getting these right and to making them feel really impactful is to get the feeling that the host is actually endorsing a product or service that they genuinely use. We already trust the host recommendations. When we marry that with hosts that feel like they are genuinely using the product or service, it feels more authentic and much more persuasive overall. So just to recap on those, aligning to motivation, aligning to content vertical, and aligning to host are the three key strategies for engaging and effective ad placement. And I will pause there and say the full report is available on the Growth Distillery. It went live today. And for any further questions, feel free to reach out. I might just pass back to Sam if there are any questions.
Thanks, Bethan. Thank you so much for that. Really interesting, guys. Are there any questions from today's session? And if not, we can pass it to you afterwards, or Damien afterwards. Bethan, thank you so much, and thank you, News Corporation, for your support of the IMAA. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Just a reminder, NT trips reducing down to 5 days for those interested, so a 5-day option. We've got a golf day coming up, so jump onto that. Brisbane and Melbourne, the 18th of April. Make sure you're involved with that. And thank you, everyone. We'll see you next week. See you, guys.